Orders of the day.
Notice of motion number 15, Deloittes Access Economics Report, Social and Economic Impact of Electronic Gaming Machine Reform Use in Tasmania.
The Honourable Member for Nelson.
Mr President, I rise today to speak on my motion, number 15 on the notice paper, on the topic of poker machine harm and the Tasmanian Government policy on preventing and reducing that harm. It's possible some in the chamber may be feeling a sense of trepidation, Mr President, given that we all know this is a topic I am passionate about. It's one that I have considerable background in, and as a result, it's one that I can speak about, previously have spoken about, at length in this place. But don't be afraid, Mr President, or other members. Today we're not debating a travesty of a bill, hundreds of pages long. We are debating a straightforward motion which notes some matters and which seeks the support of the chamber for a modest call on the government to confirm two factual matters. This is an important opportunity to put on the public and parliamentary record accurate facts in the face of government spin. It's an opportunity to begin to clarify the extent to which government policy on this matter has set aside an evidence-based approach very much in the public interest from every angle in order to pursue blatantly industry-dictated, spurious measures which are likely to result in overall more, not less, harm, Mr President. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that thousands of Tasmanians are experiencing an addiction to poker machines, and tens of thousands of Tasmanians, if not more, are affected by the poker machine addiction of someone close to them. Because evidence tells us that for every person experiencing a poker machine addiction, there are, on average, 5 to 10 people around them also being harmed. These are family members, friends, workmates and neighbours. In the event of today's debate triggering some difficulty for anyone in relation to a pokies addiction, or of it perhaps prompting someone to seek help for harm being caused by pokies, I provide the following sources of help and support on the record. Anglicare Tasmania's free Gamblers Help Service supporting Tasmanians experiencing gambling harm can be contacted on 1800 243 232. There is also a Gamblers Helpline, a 24/7 information counselling and referral service which can be contacted on 1800 858 858. And another avenue of assistance is Gambling Help Online, which can be found at www.gamblinghelponline.org.au. So, Mr President, because we haven't talked about this topic for a while in this place, and for those in the chamber who haven't been here for previous debates and discussions on the topic, first I'd like to set the scene. Poker machines are designed to be addictive. Around 1 in 6 people who regularly sit in front of them to use them as intended recreationally will become addicted to them. 40 to 60%, around half, of the losses to poker machines comes from people who struggle to control their use of poker machines. They are people who are addicted or developing an addiction and experiencing active harm. Poker machine addiction can happen to anyone. It isn't a matter of a lack of responsible decision-making or a lack of willpower or a flawed character. Poker machine addiction is physical. When the button is pressed, and during the time of anticipation while the wheels are spinning, dopamine is released in the brain. People become chemically addicted to the dopamine released in their brain during the moment of anticipation while using the machine. That is why the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM-5, has classified gambling disorder as a substance-related disorder. Continuous play on a Tasmanian poker machine allows for the press of a button every 3 seconds. This sets up a situation where people monotonously press the button, get the hit of dopamine and hit the button again. They enter the zone, as it's known, Mr President. People are not addicted to winning at pokies. In fact, people addicted to pokies are known to describe the annoyance of winning because it interrupts the flow of the zone they are in as they press the button. Evidence indicates people who are under stress are more likely to become addicted to poker machines because the state of being in the zone, dosed with dopamine hits, provides relief from stresses. This means people will be more likely to become addicted to poker machines if they are already under financial stress, if they are in a state of grief, and if they are affected by trauma in some way. Evidence also tells us that proximity to poker machine venues also increases the likelihood of developing an addiction. In Tasmania, we disproportionately locate poker machines in our poorest suburbs, where people are more likely to be experiencing higher levels of financial stress. The south of Tasmania has 23 poker machines per 10,000 people. The north of Tasmania has 35 poker machines per 10,000 people. And the northwest of Tasmania has 64 poker machines per 10,000 people, nearly 3 times as much as the southern region. In the context... In the context of southern Tasmania, we have the greatest concentration of poker machines in Glenorchy, known as the Golden Mile, with the highest LGA losses in the state by that local government area, close to $2 million per month. We know exactly how, Mr President, to make poker machines less addictive and less harmful to use. But state governments, both Tasmanian Labor and Liberal governments, have consistently chosen not to do that. Mr President, to move on to the background relevant to this motion before us, I'll provide a quick overview of the key events of recent years that have led us to where we are today. This Parliament passed legislation in 2021 which made a fundamental change to pokies licensing in Tasmania. We moved from a single statewide licence model to an individual venue licence model, and this came into effect in July 2023. This handed every pokies venue a much larger slice of the pokies revenue pie. It was a gift to the venue licence holders of a massive increase in profit from poker machines. We know from questions to the government in this chamber that in the first year under the new licensing model, pokies profits retained by the venue were up 55.91% on average statewide, with the average increase in retained profits for the top 1/3 earners of the licensed pokies venues being 61.99%. It's a massive increase in retained profits from poker machines that was delivered under that licensing change, Mr President. And we can all observe, most likely in our communities, the results of this, primarily in the near universal renovations and venue improvements that took place in pokies venues from 2023 onwards. Warnings that had been made at the time the legislation was passed were borne out. We warned an individual venue licensing model would lead to higher losses, which we understand from the evidence base to also indicate an increase in pokies addiction and harm. Pokies losses have been elevated ever since the change to the licensing model and appear to be continuing on an upward trajectory. And I compare that to the decade pre-COVID and pre-licensing change, where losses were gradually trending down. After passage of the Future Gaming Markets Bill, and as specified in that bill, then Treasurer Michael Ferguson gave a direction to the Tasmanian Liquor and Gaming Commission to undertake research on the harm minimisation options of a player card system and a facial recognition technology system. The independent Tasmanian Liquor and Gaming Commission produced a report on that research in 2022. And the clear recommendation in that report, Mr President, was that Tasmania adopt a pokies player card with programmed loss limits as the most effective way to reduce pokies harm. The Tasmanian Liquor and Gaming Commission advised that facial recognition technology was not effective in preventing or reducing pokies harm, other than for those people already in the registered exclusion schemes at the extremity of their addiction experience. Michael Ferguson MP as Treasurer then gave a directive to the Liquor and Gaming Commission to develop and implement a nation-leading pokies player card with loss limits as Liberal government policy. Mr President, that was the first time ever in Tasmania that a policy on regulation of poker machines was not directly dictated by the pokies industry. It was a momentous step forward for pokies harm reduction in this state, Mr President, that a government of the day, under Michael Ferguson as Treasurer, set their policy based on evidence from our Gaming Commission for the first time ever, not at the direction of the pokies industry itself. As a result, and as we can all imagine, Mr President, the pokies industry was strongly opposed to the card and brought influence to bear on the government, no doubt from day one. In October 2024, Max Gaming provided the government with their delivery plan report on the Tasmanian player carded gaming platform. This 173-page report showed the mandatory card was able to be implemented, providing technical details for each element and design. That was the end result of a consultation process and development process over a period of about a year and a half from the Liquor and Gaming Commission and various stakeholders, including Max Gaming. Also in October 2024, perhaps in response to industry panic about the advanced stage of development of the card and resultant pressure that the industry brought to bear on government, a Deloittes Access Economic Report was commissioned by the Department of State Growth to assess the economic and social impact of the planned card. In November 2024, the government cited the Max Gaming report as a reason to indefinitely delay rolling out the player card, claiming complexity, costs and implementation delays. However, the chair of the Gaming Commission made it clear in an interview with ABC Radio Mornings program on the 20th of November 2024 that she was, and I quote these words, disappointed and saddened that the government were indefinitely delaying the card. She stated, the chair of the Liquor and Gaming Commission stated, it was almost within our grasp to have a groundbreaking reform, which she said the Liquor and Gaming Commission fully believed in and had worked through all the issues and challenges that had been raised in consultation with Max Gaming, with Tabcorp executives, with the Liquor and Gaming branch of Treasury and with the Commission itself. The chair of the Gaming Commission confirmed in that ABC radio interview that the Liquor and Gaming Commission had put all the resolved solutions on the design of the player card system into the formal advice to Max Gaming to finalise design of the system. She confirmed that all that was needed was ministerial approval and a commitment of funding required to finalise the development and implement the card. Also in November 2024, Michael Ferguson MP, now backbencher, no longer Treasurer, told the media the gambling lobby pressured the Liberals to drop the card. He also cited that many venues are reaping enormous economic benefits of the changed licensing and taxation arrangements under the future gaming market reforms that gave venues a greater percentage of the losses. Mr Ferguson, in an ABC reporting, expressed concern about the misery of families, and that was in November 2024. It's always been clear where his motivations lie, trying to make positive progress on this, Mr President. It appears a draft of the commissioned Deloitte report was provided to the government in the first half of 2025. In June 2025, before the final version of the Deloitte report was received, the government announced it would not introduce a player card without a national approach. And in December 2025, the Deloitte Access Economics report was provided to the Tasmanian government. However, the report was not immediately released publicly. The Liquor and Gaming Commission has never recommended the introduction of a ticket-in, ticket-out system for Tasmania and currently prohibits ATMs in gaming venues in this state. I'm saying this as background for further discussion later, Mr President. However, on the 23rd of January 2026, the Liberal government announced new harm minimisation measures, and I'm putting that in inverted quotes, Mr President, quite purposefully. Announced these measures, which included longer closing hours for gaming areas in hotels and clubs, a ticket-in, ticket-out system and provisions to make self-exclusion immediate and linked to facial recognition technology. They also announced a new process for setting caps on machine numbers and that ATMs would be able to be located in venues. Also on the 23rd of January 2026, the final Deloitte report was published on the Department of State Growth website with no announcement or comment from the government. So, Mr President, that's to set the scene for the conversation that we're going to have on this motion I'm bringing to our chamber today. And as I mentioned, Mr President, Deloitte was commissioned, and this is by way of background, some more background information to the Deloitte report. Deloitte was commissioned perhaps by the Minister for Hospitality, we're not entirely sure, perhaps the government could confirm, but certainly through the Department of State Growth, Deloitte was commissioned to assess the economic and social impacts of the government's player card, which was to be mandatory for all poker machines in Tasmania and to have daily loss limits of $100 per day and an annual loss limit of $5,000. Deloitte was tasked to assess the impact of introducing the player card on the Tasmanian economy, the behaviour of poker machine customers, and on the level of gambling harm in the state. As I've already mentioned, I believe that this was done in a panicked way with the assumption that such a report would assist in discrediting the card. They could not have been more wrong, Mr President, if that was the motivation. Now, of course, the government, when it came to light this report was being commissioned, wouldn't release the terms of reference for the report at the time, even though this chamber passed a motion calling for them to be released. We never saw it. It never saw the light of day. The motivation for commissioning the report was never particularly clear. It looks like a knee-jerk reaction at the behest of the pokies industry to try and concoct a reason to block the card from being implemented. However, on the 23rd of January 2026, when the Deloitte report on the player card was released publicly on the Department of State Growth website, we saw no announcement from the government, even though it was commissioned through a government department paid for, presumably by Tasmanian taxpayers, for a purpose originally, Mr President, which has never been properly revealed. Slipped out onto the Department of State Growth website the same day that they made other announcements about other measures in an attempt to distract from it. The Deloitte report said the player card developed for Tasmania would significantly reduce losses and harm, especially from those at moderate to high risk of gambling harm, that it would lift Tasmania's gross state product, and that would deliver a net increase in jobs in this state. Mr President, on to some more detail from that report, as noted in the motion. I'm just going to make sure I have the report with me. Looking on page 11 of the report, Mr President, probably not page 11. I'm just going to find my place before I start reading about it, Mr President. Pardon me. No, I am. Page 11. I'm looking at 1.2.2 called Approach Overview on page 11 of the report, Mr President. What that outlines for us is the broad approach taken for this work commissioned by the government. It outlines that a computable general equilibrium, a CGE modelling, was used to estimate the net economic and social impacts of the player card. It outlines that 3 scenarios were modelled based on a spectrum of evidence available and to reflect different ways that behaviour may be influenced by the policy. And with that background in the approach taken, there are some key findings that have been made in the report, Mr President, that the motion speaks to and that I'm going to outline briefly for discussion here today. First one is that there was a finding from the report that the Pokies card developed for Tasmania would generate greater economic activity and increase jobs in Tasmania compared to the current situation. The central scenario, as part of that modelling work done, indicated a net increase of gross state product of around $230 million and a net increase of over 200 jobs. Mr President, if the player card was introduced, Deloitte estimated under its central scenario that these would be the outcomes: a boost to gross state product of around $230 million and similarly an increase of over 200 jobs in this state. That is nothing to sneeze at, Mr President. These are significant economic benefits to the state. The player card would reduce income for venues with poker machines, but this is offset by increases in expenditure in other sectors. Money spent on poker machines creates very few jobs compared to the same amount being spent on virtually any other goods or services in our community, Mr President. That's something that I've discussed in this place before, that $1 million spent on poker machines, for example, generates very few jobs, marginal jobs, compared to $1 million spent, even if we compared it to other areas of the hospitality industry, food and beverage, for instance, or certainly retail or other sorts of goods and services, generate far more jobs. So introducing the player card would improve economic activity compared to the current poker machine environment. A found it very interesting in the report too, on page 24 and 25, for members thinking about their local areas. There's a breakdown, a local government area breakdown across page 24 and 25 of the economic impact and the net job impact. You can see for yourself that all LGAs come out quite positively or at worst neutrally. This player card developed for our state is a benefit around the entire state, Mr. President. And some particular LGAs come out very well. Another finding from the report, Mr. President, is that the player card developed for Tasmania, the nation-leading gold standard player card, I should say, developed for Tasmania, would positively impact all industries with the exception of the EGM sector, that's the Pokies industry. And all regions would have a positive or neutral economic impact. The Deloitte report found positive economic benefit from the player card would especially be felt in regional areas that have a lot of poker machines currently. And that's because the money that was no longer being spent on poker machines under harm scenarios would be spent in other sectors of the economy and other businesses in those areas and generate more economic activity and more jobs. This means economic benefit would be felt by non-Pokies businesses in the local government areas of, for example, Devonport, because Devonport has Pokies losses of nearly $1 million every month. Burnie, Central Coast and Waratah Wynyard LGAs, where each of those have Pokies losses of about $500,000 every month. And along with the cities of Glenorchy, which I've already mentioned has Pokies losses of close to $2 million every month, and Launceston, where Pokies losses are around $1.5 million every month. In all of those scenarios, the harm that is lessened, the money that moves from being spent on harmful Pokies use is then spent in other parts of the economy in areas that generate better economic development and activity and greater jobs. For each of those areas, a significant proportion of a reduction in the losses to poker machines would get spent elsewhere in the economy. That would mean that there would be also, when we reduce poker machine harm, more available workers at higher productivity levels due to that reduction in gambling amongst the workforce, and particularly harmful gambling. And there would be substitution of pokie spending for the consumption of other goods and services, generating higher employment. Mr. President, similarly, the finding in this report in relation to the gold standard nation-leading Pokies card developed for Tasmania and ready to be rolled out, basically, with ministerial approval, the only final thing needed to press go on that implementation. The finding was that a player card would significantly reduce the poker machine gambling expenditure and harm, especially for people at moderate to high risk of gambling harm. Through its modelling, Deloitte estimated the player card would reduce total gambling losses by 23 to 46%. And I did, Mr. President, in preparation for this motion, provide a briefing paper to members for their reference in case they required some background information. And I need to make a correction in that briefing paper when I was referring to this figure of 23 to 46% reduction. I did mention there that it was in relation to poker machine losses, but in fact it was total gambling losses. But the point remains the same. In fact, the reduction in poker machine expenditure would be in the vicinity of 27 to 58%. The Deloitte report referred to research that showed cashless gambling without loss limits generally increases losses and harm, but the proposed player cards harm minimisation features of daily, monthly and annual loss limits would be particularly effective at controlling losses and therefore thereby reducing harm for people at moderate to high risk of gambling harm. Reducing the risk of higher levels of Pokies harm would decrease the demand and the cost for health, social support and justice and policing services, as well as improving productivity and community wellbeing. There's no negatives here, Madam Deputy President. All of this is upside in relation to this nation-leading card developed for Tasmania. A further finding in the report relates to the fact that the Pokies card developed for Tasmania would reduce costs to government delivered and associated services, including in healthcare, mental health support, homelessness programs, policing, courts, corrections and more. So in addition to the higher economic activity it would generate. The report shows the player card would reduce costs locally for government-associated services. Reducing poker machine losses, especially from people at risk of moderate to high-risk gambling, reduces the costs to government and creates more productive community. On page 37 of the report, I'm going to refer to page 37 of the report under 4.2, the heading being Impact of Gambling Harm to Players and Their Communities. And I'll quote from it: "The harms of gambling are far-reaching and extend beyond the direct financial impact on the individual gambler. The socio-economic impact of gambling, SEIG framework, provides a guide for assessing the quantitative, qualitative and monetary costs and benefits of gambling, covering six impact domains, including health and wellbeing, economic and financial, employment and education, recreation and tourism, legal and justice, and community and culture impacts. These can occur sequentially or in parallel. Note, while all these domains are associated with a cost to society or the economy, only some have been quantified regarding their impact on the economy." Refer to section 2. "Categories that represent costs to the individual or do not directly contribute to Tasmania's total economic production or gross state product are not in scope for the CGE modelling and therefore have not been included in the impact of the reform on the economy." So that gives you the picture, Madam Deputy President, of the extent to which they cast the net to be assessing the benefits or otherwise here of the card, and it comes out resoundingly well. Of particular note in relation to some of those areas of gambling harm costs borne by our community and economy in terms of health and wellbeing. And again, still on page 37 of the report, Madam Deputy President, under 4.2.2, health and wellbeing, it says this: "Gambling is an important public health issue, with recent estimates ranking it as the third largest contributor of disability-adjusted life years lost to ill health in Victoria, following major depression and alcohol abuse and dependence." It becomes, Madam Deputy President, that's quite shocking. It's third in the list of the third largest contributor of disability-adjusted life years lost, according to local Australian research. That's a concern. No wonder it's a cost to our health and social services sector. Also, we can see, if we turn over to page 38 of the report, there's a well-understood and well-researched link between gambling addiction and harm and increased levels of family violence. And we would all understand that that's going to be something that contributes as a cost to our community, not just economically through the services and supports that are required in that space, but through our criminal justice system, but also through our social supports. And quite frankly, Madam Deputy President, the actual human cost of anything that adds to and increases family and domestic violence. Here on page 38, and I quote, it says this: "Gambling can be detrimental to family and spousal relationships, ranging from heightened risk of tension and stress to domestic and family violence." It also says, further down that page, research has shown also that problem gambling is associated with greater rates of domestic and family violence. One survey found that 55.6% of problem gamblers reported perpetrating intimate partner violence in the previous 12 months, and 59.7% reported being victims of such violence. So, Madam Deputy President, it's a really disturbing connection there. There are so many reasons that we want to genuinely be focused on effective harm minimisation when it comes to gambling, to reduce rates of gambling addiction, which makes it all the more absolutely obscene when all this government is doing is pretending to go down that path. We also have in the report references on page 39 to the fact that there are employment and education benefits from reducing harm to gambling. And I would point people to also, perhaps particularly in terms of education and employment for young Tasmanians, Anglicare Tasmania has stated in their reports, and I'm looking particularly at their report called The Poker Machine Card, Simple As, and on page 8 of that report, where they present in a graph that between 2021 and 2022, to the next year, 2022 to 23, the number of people aged 18 to 24 who sought help from Anglicare Tasmania due to poker machine harm doubled. It doubled in 1 year, Madam Deputy President. This is not an issue and a problem that is felt only by older Tasmanians. It is one that is an active and problematic issue for young Tasmanians, and that is naturally going to flow through then and have consequences when it comes to education and to employment for younger Tasmanians. Of course, our legal system and justice system are impacted, and that's dealt with in the Deloitte report, where it points out that there are legal and judiciary impacts from gambling, primarily relating to costs associated with criminal justice and policing and costs associated with gambling-related crime. Certainly, there are very clear links between people who become advanced in a poker machine addiction and then begin potentially to commit crime, potentially often fraud, and often that affects workplaces. When people are pursuing their addiction, it's out of their control and they're desperate to find money to feed that addiction. The other point that's made here in the Deloitte report, the other point about the legal system is the fact that its further research demonstrates that poker machines are heavily involved in money laundering activities. Now, that's something that will come up a little bit later when we're talking about the government's measures, Madam Deputy President, because money laundering hasn't been a strong feature necessarily of our poker machine environment in Tasmania, unlike some other states where it has been revealed as a significant problem. But what I'm going to suggest to you as a little preview now, what I'm going to suggest to you later when we speak about the things the government plans to do instead of a gold-plated card, the things that the government plans to do are actually going to expose us to a much higher risk of money laundering becoming a feature of our poker machine environment in Tasmania. And that's just absolutely inexcusable, quite frankly. So to wrap up on this aspect of the motion, Madam Deputy President, noting the Deloitte Access Economics Social and Economic Impact of Electronic Gaming Machine EGM Reform Use in Tasmania report, I'd just like to remind the members of a few things. The report was commissioned by the government at a time that it was under pressure from the pokies industry to ditch the player card policy, and it was commissioned, I think, with the expectation of discrediting that policy. However, the report appears to then have been withheld by the government, with a significant amount of time between the draft report being provided in the first half of 2025 and the government receiving the final report in December 2025, and then the report being published on the State Growth website with no acknowledgement from the government at all in January 2026. To me, this says the government was pretty much pulled up short when this report came back with such glowing endorsement of the card developed for our state that would be nation-leading and gold standard in terms of reducing harm. And Madam Deputy President, after the January release of this report and the government's announced measures that we'll speak about in this motion as well, I asked for a briefing on the government's announced measures. And during that briefing that I was provided, and I was very grateful to be provided with the briefing, I did ask about whether the announced measures, about whether the findings of the Deloitte report, some of which we've just discussed now, had been considered by the Treasurer in the development of then the government's announced measures. And I was told in that briefing that the Deloitte report was commissioned by State Growth, not by the Treasurer or Treasury, and that neither the Treasurer nor Treasury had seen it. Madam Deputy President, that's an astonishing revelation. So we've got one part of government commissioning this report, paying for it with taxpayer dollars on a very important topic that is actually under the responsibility of the Treasurer and Treasury. And then when that report is provided then to government, into the department that commissioned it, State Growth, it then isn't apparently shared to Treasury and the Treasurer to inform any policy and decision-making on this topic by Treasury and the Treasurer. And I presume, and it's on the government to confirm or deny this, but I presume that that also means that Cabinet were not briefed on the Deloitte report and that Cabinet did not take the findings of this report into consideration when making decisions about throwing out the player card developed for our state and adopting instead a series of spurious, non-evidence-based measures that were announced in January. It could only have been a deliberate decision by the Premier, by the Treasurer, and by every Cabinet member, quite frankly, to not seek a briefing on the Deloitte report and inform themselves properly of this work commissioned by this government with taxpayer money to assess the impact of the Liberal policy on Pokies player card, which at the time it was commissioned was government policy. So now we have a policy that was originally announced by Michael Ferguson as Treasurer in a Liberal government that was not only comprehensively researched and recommended by the independent Tasmanian Liquor and Gaming Commission, but has now been shown to be positive for our state on all fronts in a report originally commissioned to try to discredit it. A policy that was ready for the final approval decision to press go on the last phase of its implementation in late 2024. A policy that every single independent expert on this topic will confirm is gold standard in preventing and reducing harm genuinely. And it is a policy that this government, panicking under pressure and influence from the powerful Pokies industry party donors, has thrown aside with no rationale able to stand up to scrutiny to justify that decision. Policy and regulatory capture of government when it comes to poker machines has always been the norm in Tasmania. Blatant, bold-faced, bully boy behaviour from an industry that has so much financial weight and influence to throw around. But this disgraceful backflip by the Rockcliffe government on a public health matter in which Tasmanian lives are at stake absolutely takes the cake. And yet, Madam Deputy President, it gets worse. When we look at what the government has the gall to propose in place of the exemplary player card. Madam Deputy President, having covered the Deloitte report briefly, but with the highlights, I'm going to now move on to part 1B of the motion, which is the Tasmanian Government's measures announced on the 23rd of January 2026. Having abandoned the evidence-based Tasmanian Liquor and Gaming Commission recommended, well-developed player card in June 2025, the Treasurer, Erica Betts, announced in January 2026 a suite of new harm minimisation measures for poker machines and their venues. And I'm using inverted commas when I say harm minimisation measures, Mr. President. These measures were presented in a media release and no further detail was available on them. So I sought a briefing on the announced measures, as did, I believe, other MPs. And I received a briefing on the 19th of February from a Treasury staff member and an advisor from the Treasurer's office. Very little detail was able to be provided in the briefing, and the Treasurer's advisor agreed to take an extensive list of questions on notice and to provide answers at a later date. I was really impressed with the engagement that I got about that, Mr. President, and pleased to be provided with some of those answers a little bit down the track. And they are presented in a document sent back to me. And it is labelled official, the document that was sent back to me. It doesn't have the signature of the Treasurer on it the way we would expect, for example, with questions on notice coming back to us in this chamber or questions without notice coming back to us. But because it was emailed to me with information in it and it is labelled official, I would like to seek leave to table it so that it's part of this debate on the parliamentary record. May I seek that leave, Mr. President?
The Honourable Member for Nelson seeks leave to table a document. The question is leave granted? Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, there are numerous questions that were taken on notice from that briefing that I received, which remain unanswered and have been indicated in the document I've just tabled as requiring advice or information from Treasury or the Gaming Commission. Before examining each of the government's announced measures, Mr President, I do want to address some overall considerations when it comes to the government's set of measures announced. And also from the answers that I received both at the briefing and then afterwards in these questions taken on notice. Straight off the bat, Mr President, the following statement is made in the answers to my questions taken on notice that catches my eye. And that statement reads this: the government is of the view that the package contains measures which can very reasonably be expected to reduce harm. Now, I want to be very clear here with members, Mr President. There is literally no basis on which the government can claim to have that expectation, reasonable or otherwise. And they have not been able to produce any evidence to back that claim of an expected reduction in harm. The new measures announced by the government were not advised by the Liquor and Gaming Commission, are not backed by evidence as being shown to reduce or prevent harm, were not consulted on publicly, and have not been assessed for their economic and social impact. In fact, Mr President, not only is there no evidence base or research to indicate these would be effective measures to reduce or prevent harm, some of the measures may well likely actively promote greater harm from pokies and introduce greater risks, for example, of money laundering. The Treasurer also says in answers to my questions taken on notice after the briefing this, and I'll quote, "A package of measures was announced earlier this year. In forming this package, which is a position of the government, input was sought from a variety of stakeholders, including the Liquor and Gaming Commission and Treasury. This input was considered by the government in coming to a decision." That's an important sequence there, Mr President, in that statement. They say input was sought and that the input was considered by the government in coming to a decision. We actually should examine that a little bit carefully, because I think that's misleading at best. And certainly it has been a topic of conversation in the other place during these two sitting weeks, last week and this week. I'm not going to reflect on that, but there are matters that came up in that need to be clarified here, so I'm going to seek to clarify them. Because in the other place, when asked about the consultation that occurred on these measures announced by the government, there was some complete confusion. Initially, when the Treasurer was asked about the consultation that was undertaken for these to inform the decisions to adopt this range of measures that were announced, the Treasurer confirmed to the Chamber in the other place that they had consulted with three organisations, Anglicare, Hospitality Tasmania and the Commissioner. And then he went on to have to correct the record later that day because he had actually misspoken there, particularly in relation to the sequence of events. And he indicated that he had personally consulted with three organisations prior to Cabinet decisions, but in fact it was only two. Prior to the decision being made by Cabinet, it was Anglicare Tasmania and Hospitality Tasmania that the Treasurer had interacted with about these measures, and that the Commissioner was consulted afterwards. So let's be really clear here. The only consultation that occurred on these measures were with Anglicare Tasmania and with Hospitality Tasmania, the peak body for the Pokies industry groups that are part of the industry here. I can guarantee you Anglicare Tasmania have been steadfast, and in fact I believe members have had a communication today from Anglicare Tasmania confirming their very clear view that the best and only reasonable way forward for our state when it comes to reducing harm from poker machines is to go with our well-developed, absolute nation-leading player card with loss limits. That is the thing that Anglicare maintains a steadfast support for. So when the Treasurer, we can guess, we can surmise, Mr President, that when the Treasurer went to Anglicare Tasmania prior to Cabinet making a decision to talk about this list of measures that the government subsequently announced, Anglicare Tasmania would have shared their very firm view with him, is what we can surmise. And in that, I'm not seeking to verbal Anglicare Tasmania, and they can certainly make it clear. I think they've been crystal clear about what their recommended and advised option is. So it wouldn't have got support from Anglicare. And the most astonishing thing about that interaction in the other place was that the Treasurer confirmed he did not speak to the Commissioner. The Liquor and Gaming Commissioner, so the Gaming Commissioner is the chair of the Gaming Commission, is the person we generally refer to as the Commissioner. And that in this state is Jenny Cranston. So the Gaming Commissioner was not consulted, the Treasurer has confirmed, prior to Cabinet making a decision on these measures. Now, Mr President, don't you think of all the people in this state that you would responsibly consult with as a government and as a Cabinet you would expect to see advice from before making a decision on such a consequential policy? Don't you think that the advice you would want to see would be from your independent Gaming Commission and from your Commissioner, the chair of that commission, to see what they thought about the potential effectiveness or otherwise of the measures being proposed to you to be decided on? That's not what happened. We then had further confusion though, and it's really important to clarify this, because the Treasurer then had to come back the next day when he was pressed further on it to talk about who he did consult with, because he got a bit tripped up about whether he spoke to, in fact, the Commission or the Commissioner and who, in fact, the Commissioner might be. And he mentioned by name a public servant, who's Jonathan Root. He was mentioned by the Treasurer in his answers to questions, and suggested that that was who he was referring to when he said he consulted with the Commissioner. I want to be really clear here, Mr President, and I think it's really unfortunate when public servants are named in this place, and so I'm just wanting to clarify, because I think there could be confusion around the role that Jonathan Root has. Jonathan Root is the Director of the Liquor and Gaming Branch, and he is, I believe, the Commissioner for Licensing. He is not the Commissioner for Gaming. The Commissioner for Gaming is the person we would refer to as the Commissioner for Gaming is the Chair of the Gaming Commission, and that's Jenny Cranston. So when the Treasurer tries to pretend that Jonathan Root was in fact the Commissioner consulted, that confuses me and concerns me even more, because if in fact what we saw was consultation with potentially a public servant in the Treasury Department, Jonathan Root, around these measures, but not the Commissioner, the Gaming Commissioner, the Chair of the Gaming Commission, then that is problematic. Where on earth did any advice from the Commission come into this? It looks like it didn't even come into it even after Cabinet had made the decision. It's all quite concerning, Mr President. The other thing that concerns me about answers provided is that the Treasurer seems to imply that he should get advice, policy advice, on poker machine regulatory matters and poker machine policy matters from Treasury, but not from the Gaming Commission. That's what he implied in the other place in his answers. And that's problematic because, in fact, under our legislation, Mr President, the Gaming Commission, the Chief Commissioner in charge of it and the other commissioners, the Gaming Commission are tasked with two things under our Act broadly. They're tasked with being the regulators of that industry and being responsible for setting and enforcing the regulation, but they are also, under our Act, tasked with providing policy advice to government, both on request and also potentially even on their own motion. That is literally a role they have under our Act to provide policy advice to government when it comes to poker machines. And this is the commission that was not consulted by the Treasurer on the measures that were adopted by government and decided on by Cabinet. And every single member of Cabinet agreed to decide on those measures ultimately without having any advice in front of them from the Gaming Commission. Every member of Cabinet. So, Mr President, let's go on to specifics about these announced measures. The first one I'm going to speak about is the announcement that there would be an extension of the gaming room closure period from 4 hours a day to 7 hours per day. Currently, Mr President, gaming areas of hotels and clubs have a mandatory 4-hour closure every 24 hours at the time of the venue's choice, and that's the minimum. So it's not that they have to be open 20 hours a day, but it's permissible that they are open up to 20 hours per day. 4 hours a day, there must be a mandatory closure. The reality is, of course, Mr President, that when the government talks about its announced increase in that closure period and trumpets the fact that it's a 75% increase from 4 hours to 7 hours every 24 hours, the reality is that that will affect very few venues statewide, because very few venues statewide operate their gaming rooms for the full currently allowable 20 hours a day. Therefore, this change is likely only to impact a very small number of venues. And quite frankly, when I tried to find out if we knew the extent of this, because if there was any proper policy development work with responsible modelling of this sort of proposal, you would think the government would have done that policy work and have an understanding of how many venues would be affected by this sort of proposal. The government, in fact, in the briefing, wasn't able to tell me whether and how many of our venues currently in the state operate at the full 20 hours a day, and how many operate less, and if so, how much less. And they weren't able to identify how many venues, therefore, would be impacted by the change they're proposing to make, so that we could therefore even begin in a very rudimentary way to understand what the impact of this change might be. The government certainly doesn't have any concept of what the impact of this change might be, because they don't even know how many venues it's going to apply to and impact on. The government also wasn't able to tell me whether the Liquor and Gaming Commission monitors or audits the opening hours of venues to be able to provide an indication of how many venues would be affected. For the Commission, they weren't able to tell me whether the Commission would even have that information. So that indicates to me, Mr President, the government have adopted this change with literally no clue as to its likely impact. They're making an assumption. They're going by the vibe of the thing, Mr President. It's the vibe of the thing. We're going to make them close. Not 4 hours, but 7 hours a day. And the vibe of the thing tells us that that's going to reduce harm. Well, that's absolute rubbish, Mr President. We know literally nothing about how much harm may or may not be reduced by that measure. We don't even know how many venues that might be likely to impact. And here's the thing. Even if we were optimistically to think that this would impact all venues and suddenly all venues were closed for a little longer each day, gaming areas are still allowed to be open under this new announcement 17 hours of every day. And gaming venues would continue to target those hours at customers at risk of experiencing harm, because that's exactly what they do now. They target the hours they know that they get players who spend the most money because they are being harmed by their gambling. Those hours include after-school drop-off, and it also includes late night and early morning hours. 17 hours a day still leaves you plenty of time to plan to target the most vulnerable people sitting in front of your machines, Mr President. And because there's no prescribed same time for the closure period, customers are also then able to move from one venue to another if one venue that they're in is about to close. Another one may well time its closing hours to not directly correlate, so that we get passage of poker machine users between venues. Of course, if we were properly developing policy in this space and we were seriously contemplating this as a proposed measure, what we would ask ourselves is, would it be valuable to have a mandatory timed shutdown that would apply to all venues, so everyone was closed at the same 7 hours a day, for example? But of course, that is not what the government is proposing. And when I put it to them and asked them whether they would be prepared to consider such a thing to even maximise the value of this virtually meaningless announcement and measure, the government indicated to me it's unwilling to mandate the closure period of 7 hours a day. Absolute rubbish, Mr President. So, Mr President, that's a strike one there. Trumpeting the fact that you're extending gaming room closing hours, mandatory closing hours, is virtually meaningless. The government cannot point to the impact it will have. There is no indication that it will meaningfully impact harm. You cannot call it a harm reduction measure. I don't believe our Gaming Commission would call it that, but the government doesn't know that because they haven't asked them. They certainly didn't ask them before deciding on the measure. Mr President, next cab off the rank in the government's measures was that they plan to introduce a ticket in, ticket out system, a TITO system, Mr President. A TITO system would replace our current coin-based system. It's so bizarre to me to see the Treasurer refer in his answers to me in the questions taken on notice and also in other circumstances, refer to this as if it's some improvement, as if it's some getting with the